With 8 seconds remaining and Indiana trailing by 1, the final timeout produced a play design that bypassed Caitlin Clark entirely. According to accounts that emerged after the game, the primary option called for a veteran guard to receive the ball and draw contact, with the outcome dependent on officials intervening. The secondary option moved the action inside, away from the perimeter shooters who had defined Indiana's offensive identity for much of the season. Clark, the player Stephanie White would later describe in the post-game press conference as someone who makes those shots all the time, was not the intended focal point of either option. That contradiction became the defining story of the night, and it did not stay contained to the locker room. What followed was a sequence that players on the roster subsequently acknowledged, without apparent hesitation, diverged from what had been drawn up. The ball moved differently than designed. Clark received a pass at the perimeter, took the shot, and Indiana won the game. On the sideline, the reaction from the coaching staff was visible and unambiguous. In the post-game media session, White confirmed that Clark's shot-making ability was not in question. She said so directly, and yet the strategic record of that final possession told a different story. One that viewers noticed immediately, and one that has amplified a debate about Indiana's coaching direction that has been building for months. The question viewers raised was straightforward. If the assessment after the game is that Clark makes those shots all the time, why was the final play not constructed to put the ball in her hands? The post-game framing and the in-game decision-making did not align. That gap is not a minor inconsistency. It is the kind of contradiction that erodes confidence in a coaching staff's credibility. And it arrived at a moment when confidence in Indiana's bench management was already under significant strain. To understand how the organization arrived at this point, it is necessary to go back through a season defined by recurring structural problems that coaches have not resolved and, in some cases, appear not to have addressed at all. Indiana entered the 2026 season with a roster constructed around Caitlin Clark's specific offensive profile. Clark operates most effectively in an open, fast-paced system that allows her to use her shooting range as a primary weapon rather than a secondary option. She creates gravity at distances most players do not threaten, which opens driving lanes and mid-range opportunities for the players around her. When defenses collapse to contain that gravity, her passing ability converts those rotations into open looks. That is not a complicated system to understand. It is, however, a system that requires a coaching staff willing to build its offensive philosophy around those parameters. For stretches of this season, Indiana has not played that way. The offense has operated through patterns that reduce Clark's role to a conventional guard function, limiting her off-ball movement and constraining the spacing that makes her generational shooting ability functional. Opposing scouts have adjusted accordingly. When Indiana becomes predictable, the defensive coverages become simpler, and the advantages Clark creates through range and pace are neutralized before possessions develop. Players have referenced these limitations in interviews throughout the season, though typically in language careful enough to avoid direct criticism. The consistent thread across those comments is a description of a system that does not reflect the team's actual personnel strengths. When professional athletes, whose livelihoods depend on those strengths being utilized, characterize their own offensive scheme as limited, that assessment carries weight. It is not the language of players promoting a shared vision. It is the language of a locker room that has been waiting for something to change and has not seen it happen. The late-game sequence described above did not occur in isolation. It arrived as the most visible expression of attention that had been accumulating through practices, film sessions, and game situations where the designed approach and the personnel available appeared to be working against each other. The fact that the improvised play succeeded is secondary to what it revealed. Players in a high-pressure situation made a collective judgment that their own read of the game was more reliable than the instruction they had been given. That is an extraordinary development in any professional environment. Athletes are trained from early in their careers to operate within systems, to execute assigned roles, and to defer to the coaching staff on strategic decisions. The structure of professional basketball depends on that deference functioning even when individual players disagree with specific calls. When that structure breaks down publicly, when players not only deviate from a designed play but subsequently discuss that deviation openly on social media with the apparent approval of teammates, it represents something more significant than a single tactical disagreement. The social media activity after the game confirmed the extent of the disconnect. Players shared graphics and commentary that acknowledged the improvisation directly. Teammates engaged with that content in ways that validated rather than distanced themselves from the decision. There was no apparent effort from any member of the roster to frame what happened as an accident or a miscommunication. The collective public posture was one of candid acknowledgement that the design play was set aside and that the outcome justified that choice. The post-game press conference, meanwhile, produced the statement that Stephanie White would almost certainly prefer to take back. Describing Clark as a player who makes those shots all the time, in the immediate aftermath of a final play that did not target Clark as the primary option, handed critics the clearest possible evidence for the argument they had been making for weeks. The coaching staff had already been under scrutiny for rotation decisions, timeout usage, and offensive scheme construction. The post-game quote did not create the credibility problem. It crystallized it. White's comment was not made carelessly. It reflected a genuine assessment of Clark's ability. But that assessment, offered after the fact, raised the question that viewers articulated directly in response. If this is the established evaluation, why did the designed play not reflect it when the game was on the line? The absence of a coherent answer to that question is itself informative. Either the play design did not account for what the coaching staff privately acknowledged about Clark's capability, or there are factors influencing late-game decisions that have not been explained publicly. Neither possibility reflects well on the strategic process. The organizational picture around this coaching situation has been complicated further by separate controversies that preceded the late-game incident. Indiana has received a league warning related to injury reporting practices. A beat reporter who had covered the organization was denied credentials, removing an independent voice from the press access that normally functions as a check on institutional narratives. These are not basketball decisions. They are organizational posture decisions, and the pattern they form, combined with the coaching concerns, suggests a franchise operating with limited accountability at multiple levels simultaneously. The credential revocation of Scott Agness was particularly notable. Agness had provided consistent, detailed reporting on the organization for an extended period. Beat reporters are the mechanism through which fans and analysts receive information that the organization does not control. Removing that access does not eliminate the information, it redirects it. Players, agents, and league personnel still talk. What changes is the structure of accountability and the signal sent to others covering the team about what kind of scrutiny will be tolerated. A league warning on injury reporting arrived in the same period. Injury reporting in professional basketball is not a procedural formality. It is a transparency mechanism that allows coaches, opponents, bettors, and the public to make informed assessments. When an organization operates outside those reporting requirements, it suggests either systemic disorganization or a deliberate choice to manage information in ways the league considers improper. The warning itself does not specify intent, but combined with the credential decision, it reinforces a picture of an organization that has been managing its information environment more aggressively than the league's standards permit. These developments matter because they establish the context in which the coaching controversy is occurring. A franchise navigating this many institutional concerns simultaneously is not in a position of strength. Personnel decisions made under those conditions tend to reflect organizational instability rather than clear strategic planning. Stephanie White entered this season with questions already circulating about her system's compatibility with the roster's talent profile. Those questions have not been resolved. They have grown more specific, more public, and more difficult to dismiss as outside observer noise. The viewer response to all of this has been consistent in its direction, if not always in its precision. The frustration expressed in comments about the organization reflects something beyond a single game result. Fans who have invested in this roster, who understand the commercial and competitive significance of what Indiana has assembled, are watching a coaching situation that appears unable to leverage what it has been given. The anger in audience responses is not irrational. It is the reaction of people who can see the gap between what this team could be and what it is being asked to do on the floor. The Caitlin Clark dimension of this story cannot be separated from the broader coaching critique, because Clark is not simply one player among 12. She is the player whose presence transformed Indiana's commercial standing, whose draft arrival drew national attention to women's professional basketball in ways the league had not seen in years, and whose on-court profile requires specific structural support to function at its ceiling. A coaching staff that consistently fails to build its game-time decisions around that profile is not making neutral tactical choices. It is making choices with outsized consequences for the franchise's competitive trajectory. When White acknowledged after the game that Clark makes those shots all the time, she was describing a player whose ability she does not dispute. The reasonable inference from that acknowledgement, applied to the game situation that preceded it, is that the play should have been designed for Clark. The fact that it was not will not be resolved by post-game statements. It will only be resolved by a demonstrable change in how the coaching staff constructs late-game situations, in how it uses timeouts, in how it manages the offensive system during the possessions that determine outcomes. That change has not yet been visible in a consistent way. Individual games have produced moments where the system appeared to function as designed. But the recurring pattern, predictable coverages, limited perimeter spacing, late-game decisions that do not center the roster's most capable shooters, has persisted long enough that characterizing it as an adjustment period no longer carries analytical weight. A head coach in a professional environment is expected to identify structural problems and correct them within a reasonable time frame. The time frame for expecting correction of these particular problems has passed. The organization now manages a situation in which the players have, by their own public account, executed a late-game sequence that diverged from the coaching staff's design and succeeded. The coaching staff's post-game assessment acknowledged the players' ability in terms that made the divergence harder to defend, not easier. The social media record shows roster members treating the improvisation as an achievement rather than a lapse. And the institutional backdrop, credential revocations, league warnings, ongoing questions about organizational management, offers no stabilizing counterweight. What the Indiana organization does with this situation in the coming weeks will determine how much further this fracture develops. If the coaching staff responds by contracting the roles of the players who deviated, the on-court consequences will be measurable and the fan response will be immediate. If the organization opts for a leadership change, the transition carries its own risks, particularly if it is handled in a way that further disrupts what chemistry the roster has developed. If nothing changes, the current dynamic, where players make real-time judgments that their instincts are preferable to the designed scheme, becomes the operating standard, which is not a sustainable condition for any coaching staff trying to build toward a playoff run. The deeper issue is one that no single game result resolves. Indiana has a player in Caitlin Clark whose capabilities are not in dispute by anyone, including the head coach who publicly acknowledged them after the game. The question of whether the coaching system is constructed to maximize those capabilities, or whether it is, in fact, working against them, is one that the organization has an obligation to answer through its decisions, not its press conference language. Viewers have been asking that question throughout this season. The late-game sequence and the commentary it generated from players, coaches, and fans alike has not answered it. It has made it more urgent. The post-game quote will not age well if the pattern continues. Acknowledging that a player makes those shots all the time after a game in which the final play was not designed for that player is the kind of statement that becomes a reference point in ongoing narratives about organizational decision-making. It joins a record that includes credential revocations, league warnings, sideline confrontations, and a roster that appears more confident in its own judgment than in the instructions it receives. That record is now long enough and public enough that it cannot be addressed through communication strategies or selective transparency. It can only be addressed by what Indiana does on the floor in the final minutes of close games with the players it has. The viewers asking what is wrong with this organization are not asking an abstract question. They are describing a pattern they can see from the outside and a standard of accountability they expect the organization to apply to itself. The answer to that question will not come from press conferences. It will come from whether, the next time Indiana has the ball down by 1 with seconds left, the play is designed for the player the coaching staff has already acknowledged can make the shot.